I am 41 years old, and I'm still a big fan of comic book Jesus. I feel like comic book Jesus, like resurrection comic book Jesus, the hair flowing in the wind back there. He's got all the power coming out of the tomb and radiating all around him. I think there's something about our faith, no matter how old we may be, that, man, we resonate with, we worship a Jesus that comes out with all of this power. And certainly our kids, our culture, are saturated, or you might even say oversaturated, with this idea of hero. Our Vacation Bible School, which is for ages 3 all the way up through kids who are completing 5th grade, our VBS theme this year is Superhero Training Camp. Again, that's Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday evenings, starting 2 weeks from tomorrow. You can still sign up your kids at powellchurch.com or on the Church Center app and find information about that. There is still time to sign up as well to volunteer if you're interested in doing that as well. We're grateful for all the folks who have reached out and helped us in those capacities. What we know is kids like heroes. And not just like, there's this sense that when we are younger and maybe a little more impressionable, we look for heroes. It's almost as if we're wired to find these role models or these icons or these people in our lives who seem, in fact, larger than life and help us connect in some way that we might want to be some piece of them when we grow up. We've spent the last few weeks asking you online who your heroes were when you were a kid and who your heroes are now. And as we've received some of those, I've thought maybe the better question would have been, who did you dress up as for Halloween when you were a kid? Because there's a significant overlap, right? Usually in who we aspire to be or who we're drawn to, or, I mean, sometimes it's, whatever movie just came out that month or whatever the case may be. But there's something about us that is drawn to these ideas and images of the heroic. And it's noteworthy that, as we talk about a lot, what Jesus calls us to is childlike faith. So there is something inherently childlike, I think, in this idea of looking at someone else and being drawn to something that they have that inspires us in these different kinds of ways. Now, I say our culture is saturated and maybe oversaturated with this because if you look at the movies that make the most money, what do they all have in common? We've got up on the screen, these are the highest grossing movies in the history of the United States. Let me say a word. I heard, is that disappointment almost? Or people are like, oh man, it's these movies? It is these movies. Say a word about the phrase highest grossing. These are the movies that made the most money. All of these have come out in the last, Avatar is the original Avatar is the oldest one. These are all movies that have come out in the last 10 or 12 years. That's because, I don't know if you know this, but if you go see a movie right now in Knoxville, Tennessee, you're gonna pay about $16.50 at the box office for a ticket. And I don't know about you, but I remember growing up and paying something that had a 5 in front of it. And if my grandparents were living, they would tell me when I went, it was 10 cents or whatever the case may be. So inflation rules this conversation. When we're talking about highest grossing, we're talking about the movies that have made the most money, which means that all of them are going to come really recently because ticket prices have continued to increase and there's 3D and IMAX and all that good stuff. There's a whole other more interesting, I think, conversation for a different Sunday maybe to talk about what movies have sold the most tickets ever if you adjust their box office for inflation. For instance, we think something like 200 million people saw Gone with the Wind in a movie theater, which I think came out in 1939. Something like 175 million people saw the original Star Wars in a movie theater in between 1977 and today. So there's a separate list if you adjust ticket prices for inflation that tells us what films have most resonated with American culture, things like E.T., Titanic, Sound of Music, these kinds of things. So there's that list, but if you're just looking at what makes the most money, it's these movies. Note that these that have made the very most money in the United States, it's not just that they are kind of superhero films, it's that 3 of them draw back kind of on our own childhood, at least if you're in my age bracket. Star Wars The Force Awakens came out in 2015. This is the first movie that brought back Han Solo and Chewbacca and Princess Leia and all of that good stuff. And kids who grew up watching the original movies from 1977 to 1983 and then had kids of their own and all that good stuff, everybody was drawn back to an entire generation or multiple generations of wanting to go see that. Spider-Man No Way Home came out 2 Christmases ago. Spoiler alert, contains not just the current Spider-Man, but the actors who played Spider-Men in previous films going back about 20 years. So a shorter time span, but still kind of a reconnection with childhood. Top Gun Maverick, man. Yes, right? A year ago this week, my wife and I closed on our house and went to a staff meeting at this church, and we were doing all these things in Powell for the first time at 200 miles an hour while still being the pastor where we were in Virginia for about another 2 weeks. And our lives were moving so fast, but we were like, I feel the need. So in the midst of that whirlwind, we went to see Top Gun Maverick because if you are my age, I grew up on the playground at Alcoa Elementary School playing Maverick and Goose with my friend Josh Webb on the swing set. We had to trade off who was Goose for obvious reasons every day, but like there's something about this that is, it's not just that the movies that make the most money are heroic or superhero films. It's that for the most part, the ones that make the very most money, at least in the United States, are not only superheroes for the present, but they tie back into our own stories, our own childhood, because there's something, I think, still childlike in us. And Jesus would affirm, this is not to say that Jesus would love all 5 of these movies or hate all 5 of these movies. I think most of them are really great. But I think there's a truth to say there's something in us as children that we still lead with our wallets on as adults when it comes to what we watch and what we participate in. And there's something about aspiring to be a hero that I think has a healthy intersection with what it is to have childlike faith. Now, we asked you these questions. Who were your heroes when you were a kid? Who are your heroes now? What made them heroic? And those of you that took our survey, when we asked who are your heroes when you were a kid, by far, superheroes and celebrities tied for number 2 on the list. There were some other kind of scattered things down here, but at number 2 on the list when we were kids, superheroes and celebrities, both very prevalent, very powerful. We heard about all kinds of different examples of superheroes and celebrities that you really enjoyed when you were a kid. Me too. As adults, that pool kind of gets a little more spread out because as adults, there were some of us who still said, yep, there's a superhero who's still, I view as heroic as an adult. There are some celebrities maybe that you still view as heroic as an adult, but we also heard a lot more about authors and songwriters and scientists and teachers. So as an adult, what is number 2 through 10 was much more diverse. As a kid, hard at number 2 was celebrities and superheroes. But here's the thing. Do you know what was number 1? What category was number 1 on both lists? When we ask you, who were your heroes when you were a kid? Number 1 category on the list was people in your family. And as adults, when we ask you, who are your heroes? The number 1 category was people in your family. And this is really interesting to me because the superhero worship and all that stuff is real and I think it can be good up to a point. But when we dress up for somebody as Halloween, for Halloween, we are essentially pretending to be them, right? When we say we look up to someone in our own family or we look up to someone in our own household, it's not that we're pretending to be that person. Is that there's something real that's happening there in that relationship that moves in and through our lives, both as kids and as adults, to see some aspect or some piece of that and say to ourselves, that's something that I would like to have or demonstrate in my own life. The examples that can make the biggest impact are it seems, the ones that hit closest to home, the real people that we can interact with and all that good stuff. Now, good job in church world. No one put Jesus was their hero, even though you might have been tempted to say that was the answer we were looking for. Good job on the survey, not doing the stereotypical answer. When it comes to comic book Jesus and it comes to these things, like, again, there's all kinds of heroic truth about Jesus. There are all kinds of heroic acts. That's why at Vacation Bible School in a couple weeks, our kids are going to hear about these 3 really powerful and heroic things that Jesus did. But when we look at these 3 stories here on Sunday mornings, as for the most part, grown-ups, or at least theoretical grown-ups, right? There's this sense of not just how do we see Jesus' heroism at work, but how do we see ourselves in these stories? Because I think none of us, when we're saying, well, I want to be Maverick, or I want to be Captain America, or I want to be Obi-Wan Kenobi, or whatever the case may be, there's this bit that we're pretending to do those things. When it comes to Jesus, we certainly wouldn't say that we're pretending to be Jesus, but also just being human beings, like the sentence, I feel a lot like Jesus when I do this. Like, that's usually not a sentence we use, or at least it's not one that I use, because I'm well aware that I am not him. I'm well aware because of my own human nature, my own sin, my own everything, that the gap between who Jesus is and who I am when it comes to day-to-day earthly living and all that stuff is significant. So on its face, we wouldn't necessarily look at Jesus and say, you know what, I feel a lot like Jesus when I do this. When I helped that old lady cross the street, I really felt a lot like Jesus. But when we look at the story this morning, that dynamic is really interesting with the way Jesus, in fact, looks at us. Here's one of the stories they're going to hear at Vacation Bible School. We share it this morning. This is from the Gospel of Matthew. I'm going to start in verse 25. This is Matthew 14, starting in verse 25. Early in the morning, Jesus came walking toward them on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "That's a ghost," and cried out in fear. Immediately, Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it's I. Don't be afraid." Peter answered Jesus, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." Jesus said, "Come on." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. When Peter noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught Peter, saying to him, "You have little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got on the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped Jesus, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Peter's question is, "Lord, if it's you," right? I think, though, with what follows, it can't really be a question of identity, or else Peter is the dumbest person who's ever lived. If you're just curious if that's really Jesus, you don't ask that. You don't say, "If that's really you, ask me to come out there." If it's purely a question of identity, you're going to, "Jesus, if that's really you, what's my favorite color? What's my social security number?" Right? It's not a question purely of identity. Peter is not just curious if that's really Jesus out there. He's internalized an action component of this, which is to say, if that's really Jesus, and we are his disciples, and he's out there doing this thing, I wonder if we could do it too. If that's really Jesus, and he's out there doing this thing, and we're his, remember, this is not the crowds, this is just the guys in the boat, just the disciples. If that's really Jesus, and he's out there doing this thing, and we indeed are his disciples, I wonder if we could do this too. Rob Bell, who's an author and former pastor that I really love, has a great teaching on this from 20 years ago where he talks about that it's not a question so much of does Peter believe that that's Jesus, There's a component here of Jesus believing in Peter. Because when he says, if that's you, call me to come out there, Jesus doesn't say, you're not ready for this. Jesus doesn't say, look, man, you're going to take about 3 steps and then you're going to sink and cry out for me and it's going to be embarrassing for us both and then I'm just going to pick you up and put you back in the boat and all that good stuff. Even if he has the knowledge of that's what's getting ready to happen, he doesn't stop him from doing that either. Peter says, if that's you and I'm your disciple, can I do that too? And Jesus says, come on. This is a key difference between a student and a disciple. If you think about your heroes, some of you that mentioned teachers, both when you're a kid and an adult, a teacher can be an incredibly potent and powerful hero. A teacher has an opportunity to change the trajectory of a student's life, course, all these kinds of things. But when we think of ourselves as students, a student really wants to learn information from a teacher. Right? When I think about the best teachers that I have, they were the ones not just that gave me good information, but impacted the way I thought about learning itself. Made me want to be a history major, or inspired me to be more creative, or made all of these kind of important intersections in my life. But as good as a student-teacher relationship can be, the difference between that and a rabbi and a disciple is a disciple is not just trying to learn information from the teacher or from the rabbi. The disciple is trying to be like the rabbi, trying to live like the rabbi, not just learn from them. And in this way, Peter sees Jesus doing a thing and asks this question, can I do that too? When we seek to follow Jesus, there's this component of, if we are his disciples, we are trying, not just trying, but guided and empowered by the Holy Spirit to have these lives that are becoming more and more sanctified, more and more like Jesus every day, even in small baby steps on the water, to see Jesus at work in a thing, and then maybe to begin to believe for ourselves, can I do that too? And if this water walking bit is too much for you, perhaps it's the turning the other cheek. Can I do that too? Forgiving somebody who has definitely wronged me. Could we do that too? Being self-sacrificial instead of just leading with what makes us feel good. Could we do that too? And Jesus says, come on. Knowing he's going to fall, he's going to walk for a couple seconds, and then he's going down. But be careful how you hear that, you of little faith, why did you doubt? To me, I always like to think of this much more as like learning how to ride a bike, you know? You remember when you learned how to ride a bike, all of us theoretical grown-ups? When you're learning how to ride a bike, there comes a moment in there where like there's been training wheels and someone's guiding you, and then someone lets you go, and for that brief first second, you are doing it. And then the next thing you usually think is, oh crap, I'm doing it. And then the next thing that happens is down we go, right? It's kind of inherent in the process of this thing. And I hope you had people, and I hope you still have people who help pick you up and say, hey man, you were doing it. You were doing it. You can do it. I don't think this is scolding from Jesus to say, you have little faith, why did you doubt? What an idiot, any of these things. I don't think that's how Jesus operates at all. I think there is a piece of this, hey, you were doing it. And you were doing it implies that we can do it again. Because the truth is, we may be very uncomfortable with the idea of, I feel a lot like Jesus when I do this, or I feel a lot like Jesus when I do that. But Jesus invites us to a life that models his own, gives us his very spirit, as we celebrated at Pentecost last week, to live in us, to help us become more and more like him. And maybe we should never get comfortable being like, man, I feel a lot like Jesus today. But what we can do is offer that to someone else. To be people who speak into the lives of others to say, hey, when I see you do that, that looks a little like Jesus. When I see you be so patient, that looks a little like Jesus. When I see you let that thing go, because if it was me, I would have held on to it for decades. But when I see you let that thing go and move on to the next day, that looks a little like Jesus. Sometimes one of the most heroic things that we can do is speak that life into someone else. To be people who are great, or becoming great anyway, at encouraging each other. To say, man, when you do that, when I see you do that I see Jesus in you. That's our challenge for you this morning. Because when you think about the people in your life, the people you're closest to, those family members, those friends, the people who have real value in your life, how can we affirm each other to say, man, when I see you do that, I just want you to know that I see Jesus in you. I think we're not wired to see it in ourselves, and probably healthy that we're not wired to think it or speak it of ourselves. But hearing it from others, as we're all trying to do this thing together, can be one of the most powerful things that we do as Christians.